Please welcome to the stage Mr. Roy Rosin. Roy Rosin is the Chief Innovations Officer at the Penn Medical Center and has 3 kids in the Radnor School District, 1 here at the high school. Tonight, Mr. Rosin will be exploring how problem framing unlocks innovation and reveals solutions in the most unlikely of places. So, join me in welcoming Mr. Rosin with the talk entitled Reframing Problems.
So we're going to go with the virtual clicker. This means click, because it's not working. So occasionally in my life, I am referred to as Mr. Rosin at Radnor High School. I very proudly go by Mr. Rosin's little brother. So I'll keep that with pride. I have a freshman here at Radnor, and he is generally on time. And he's on time because of our wonderful neighbor, Claire, who is a senior with a car. The other day, Claire wasn't able to drive, and my wife gave our freshman a ride, and they did not make it by 7:35. That evening, my son said something interesting. He said, "Mom drove too slowly." It's a really interesting problem statement, because it basically says, well, if the problem is the speed of transit, then the solution clearly is drive faster. And now we can use very common tools about problem analysis, root cause analysis, 5 whys, so we're not going after the symptoms but the root. But if you do these common tools on the wrong problem statement, something interesting happens. So why were we not going faster? Oh, well, we weren't pressing hard enough on the pedal. Okay, so press hard on the pedal. Why weren't we pressing harder on the pedal? Maybe we didn't want to get a ticket. Oh, so the solution now is get a better lawyer. So maybe not the most constructive. And instead, you could say, well, there are other factors going on here. And this is where problem reframing gets so interesting. Maybe it was what time you got out of bed. How long did you spend brushing your teeth? Did you have your bag packed the night before? And how long did you spend petting the puppy, which is probably the real issue. So I've been fascinated by problem framing for a long time, especially because you start to see out in the world, in the commercial world, what an incredible difference it can make, how the solution set changes when the problem statement or the problem framing changes. So I went to high school in the 80s. And in the 80s, if you wanted to rent a car in a big airport, you were going to face the worst line ever invented by humankind. You'd be in that car, that rental line, for absolutely hours. And you can imagine a place like Hertz trying to fix this and wanting to improve the experience and studying it. And the most obvious thing you would see in this end-to-end experience is the speed of the line. So your most likely problem statement or initial problem solution framing is the line is too slow. So if the problem statement is the line is too slow, what's better? Faster, right? So that's interesting, right? You say, well, why is the line too slow? Maybe our staffing model is wrong. Maybe the paperwork is such that it takes too long to process each person in line. So that normal problem analysis of root cause and 5 whys can get you to a new staffing model, or it can get you to better paperwork that makes people go through the line faster. But try the other thing first. This is the essence to unlocking real innovation with problem framing. Before you do the 5 whys, we do what's called the 5 so whats. You go the other way. The line is too slow. So what? What would be good about that? Well, if the line was faster, I'd get to my car more quickly. Now you have an interesting problem framing, right? So it's not the speed of the line, it's the time from when the plane lands to when you're in the car on the way. Now you can invent Hertz Gold. And this is an interesting thing as you look around the world in other situations. If you go back to the beginning of Gillette, long before they became a multi-billion-dollar company bought by Procter & Gamble, they wanted to be customer-centric. And so they went to their customers and said, how do we make a better blade? And the customer said, well, the blade's not sharp enough. And if you go back to your team and say the problem is the blade isn't sharp enough, what do you get? Sharper blade, right? If you try this 5 so whats before the 5 whys, something interesting happens. So what would be good about a sharper blade? Oh, I'd get a closer shave. And this is where it starts to get annoying and difficult if you're supposed to have any expertise. You have to keep going. Well, what would be good about a closer shave? Now, don't forget, you're supposed to be an expert in shaving. You work for Gillette. And your customers are looking at you funny going, what would be good about a closer shave? And they'll tell you, though. They'll say, look, I hate shaving. I want an outcome. I want a certain outcome without all the shaving. So it's actually not the sharpness of the blade. It's probably something more like how quickly the hair comes back, right? So if you start to understand this problem statement, you actually can do something interesting. They're now up to 7 blades at last count. The way this works is the first blade actually picks up the hair, the next blade cuts at a point below your skin. I don't care how sharp your blade is, you can't normally cut below my skin. But if you realize that this is about how long before the hair returns, you might invent electrolysis. It's not about sharpness, it's not even about blades anymore. I moved recently to the healthcare industry and saw this again in spades. So one of the first projects that lands on my desk is a bunch of people who are really adamant about online scheduling of doctor's appointments. And they asked me to go and help them implement this way of doing online scheduling of doctor's appointments like OpenTable. I noticed there's so many people here tonight. All the tables, every time slot is available in our local restaurants. So you must have a good pull here at Radnor. So I sat with this team and I said, okay, we can do this. This is it's not hard to imagine how we do online scheduling. It seems like a great idea. Hey, tell me, what would be good about that? Why is that important to you? Again, the 5 so whats. And starting just with rich narrative, with the stories. Every single story was about the same thing. Access. I need a dermatology appointment. I can't get in for 3 months. I need a neurologist. I can't get in for 5 months. Had we gone forward and done online scheduling, the only thing that would have changed would how fast and easy it would be to see that you can't get in, which I don't think actually solves the problem very well. So as I look beyond in healthcare, some of my favorite innovations now reveal this wonderful opportunity for problem reframing. I'll just hit 2 here. So Lucky Ironfish and Life-Saving Dot, which you may have heard of. They've gotten some great news coverage. So Lucky Ironfish is a Canadian guy up in Cambodia who notices an extreme incidence of anemia, low iron in the blood. And so you can start to imagine what the initial problem statement is, or what the experts say the problem is here, right? So if you have anemia, they say change your diet, you need more iron, or take supplements. In the Life-Saving Dot in the lower right, you have women in rural India who are very poor, who are not having enough iodine. Again, it's a dietary problem. Change your diet, change what you eat, take your supplements. So very, very similar in nature. The reality is, people aren't going to change their diets. And we all know they're not going to take their medications. Compliance is low. Tastes aren't going to change, income isn't going to change, access to different foods isn't going to change. It's just not going to work this way. Up in the upper left, the gentleman in Cambodia starts to realize that people who cook with heavy iron skillets, the iron actually can leach into the food and start to address and make the incidence of anemia go down. He tried this a couple different times. He started with iron blocks. That didn't work. In fact, people not only thought they were ugly, they were worried they'd scratch the pots. When he came back to see what was happening with them, people were using them as doorstops. So that was not a very effective solution. But then he found that this tricantrop, the fish shown there, which is the symbol of health and luck in Cambodia, was something people liked. They left it in their pot. They didn't change behavior. They cooked as they did before, and the iron leached in, and the incidence of anemia went down. In the case of the Life-Saving Dot, again, it wasn't about education, it wasn't about diet change, it wasn't about medication adherence. In fact, iodine is something that can be absorbed through the skin. It's about delivery of iodine. So they took the bindi, every woman in this area pretty much wears a bindi on her forehead. They took the bindi, they soaked the bindi in iodine. You do the same thing you were doing before. Every morning you put your bindi on, 16 cents for 30 of them to last a month, and now you're getting the iodine that you need, just absorbed through your skin. No change in behavior. So this problem reframing is critical. And if I keep going, again, actually, let's go to the other coast here, back to America now. A couple kids at Stanford who see a really interesting problem. Premature, low birth weight babies have a very high mortality rate. Unfortunately, about 4 million babies around the world are still dying within their first month. So they're very early, very small, can't regulate their body temperatures. At some point, someone invented an incubator, saved a lot of kids. But as they go around the world, they actually start to see that there are still all these babies dying. They're being born in places that often don't have an incubator. These incubators cost $20,000 and they require a continuous supply of electricity. So as they start to think about, well, how do we get these babies to the incubators? Because that is a good solution. You can use this technique of the 5 whys to change that problem statement, and it changes what you're able to do. Right? So what would be good about getting these low birth weight premature babies to an incubator faster? The answer is they'd get to that appropriate stable temperature more quickly. So that's really what you're trying to do. And in that case, instead of $20,000 and requires electricity, you can have something that's $300 and has now saved about 150,000 babies. The Embrace Baby Warmer, an absolutely wonderful invention that changed the way you actually have to think about what women will do to save their children. Women actually don't want in these areas to put their baby inside a machine. They want the baby against their body. So actually the one on the right not only is much, much less, but it actually is something people will use to get the outcome. And so here's an example in healthcare of how painful and difficult, like in the shaving example, this really can be. We were approached by a senior executive to solve this problem that discharges were getting too late in the day. People were leaving the hospital too late in the day. And it's a great example that sometimes we solve the wrong problem because we're asked or told to solve the wrong problem. So discharges later in the day, let's go through the stories. Well, what would be good about that? Not why, but what would be good about earlier in the day? Well, it ends up that we have 50 people who need chemotherapy. We only have 10 beds. Okay, I need to get those guys out to get the new people in. Got it. Oh, that's interesting. So it's not time of day, it's length of stay. In other words, earlier the next day isn't better than later the day before. It's how long they're in the hospital, right? Got it. Okay. Well, what would be good about a shorter length of stay? Really? Well, okay, let's think. I just told you, I need to get those people out to get these people into the bed for their chemo. Oh, so it's not length of stay, it's actually time to a bed. Well, what the heck is the difference? You're just playing around with words, right? Well, no, not at all, because again, every time you change the problem, the solution set changes. In one of those cases, time to a bed versus length of stay, in one of those cases, the number of beds you have matters, and the other one, the number of beds you have doesn't change length of stay at all, right? Okay, so it's time to get to bed, I get it. Well, what would be good about time to a bed? I just told you 3 times, right? They need their chemo. Oh, it's not time to bed. Right? It's time to get your chemo. And so every time you change the problem, your solution set does change. And in fact, now when you get to time to treatment, not only do you not necessarily need a bed, it may not be in the hospital. There may be no discharge whatsoever. So the whole thing now reveals opportunities for innovation you never had. So how do you do this other than the storytelling and the 5 so whats instead of the 5 whys? The best way I've ever found to get to the real problem you're solving is deep immersion in the world. You have to go embed yourself contextually, right? So if you have heart failure, and this is a good example, you usually come back to the hospital, you're admitted back to the hospital because you didn't take your meds or you didn't stick to your low sodium diet or something along those lines. It's generally seen that the problem here is that people either didn't understand how important those things were or they forgot. In which case then the solutions, if that's the problem framing, the solutions would be education and reminders. What if those are the wrong problems altogether, right? So in this case, you go into their home, you embed yourself in their life, and you see something like this, right? You see this Trader Joe's favorites. What's going on here? It ends up if you spent your life eating high sodium foods, you like the taste of salt. Things that don't have sodium taste terrible. These are the only two things that this patient has tried that she might try again. So when you start to see artifacts like that, you say, you know what? I would do better to invent a tasty low-sodium diet than education and reminders. I was going after the wrong problem. And these things, this approach can change the world. One of my favorite stories happened in Bangladesh. Rita Colwell is a biologist who was going after cholera in Bangladesh. And it's a terrible disease. It was still, not that long ago, killing thousands of children mostly, others as well. And it's a kind of disease that is understandable if you immerse yourself in the culture. So Rita, as this biologist, dove in, right? She understands it's driven by bacteria that live in the fresh water supplies where they gather the water. She understands that the bacteria hitches a ride along with these plankton that bloom at certain times of the year in particular. She understands the jugs that the women use, how they dunk them underwater, the water goes into the jug. She sees the dress, the clothes, and she has an idea. She says, you know what, this is interesting. I think I can create a filter. What if, because the plankton is sizable that the bacteria is attached to, what if I can filter it out? And she experiments and finds that if you fold sari cloth over 4 to 8 times, and the sari cloth these women are wearing or have around their house, you actually let the water come into the jug. You see how the cloth is over the top of the jug. So you dunk it, the water goes in, but the plankton carrying the bacteria don't go in. In fact, you can strain out 99% of it, and it's an amazing solution. At the time, the experts were saying, oh, you have bacteria in the water, simple. What we need to do, the problem is that people aren't boiling their water. We need to get them to boil their water. But because she was embedded and immersed in this culture, she knew, not possible. They need fuel to boil the water. Fuel is wood. Wood is scarce and very expensive. They're not going to be able to do it. This solution cut cholera by 50%. Absolutely remarkable. And I'll end on this story, a very brief history of the shipping industry. It's one of my favorite stories that kind of gives you this idea that you have to be able to see what people have missed. There it is, the very brief history of the shipping industry. It's right there in the 1950s, you have this great ship, right? And so in the 1950s, everyone said shipping was going to die. No more, right? It's the only way anything got around the world up until that point. But the costs were going through the roof, the theft was going through the roof, delivery times were going through the roof, and it wasn't for want of people innovating. There were thousands of people innovating to try to solve this really urgent problem, because this was commerce, right? And at the same time, they said, well, now these newfangled airplanes, they're going to take everything by air. So people studied this problem, and they said, well, it's simple, right? The ship goes from port A, thousands and thousands of miles across the water, to port B. So 99.9999% of this journey is across the water. Let's innovate there. The fastest ship to get across fastest. The first nuclear freighter to save on fuel. Ships designed for small crews, right? Because there's a lot of human cost in getting across that water. All failed. And the way the story goes is one day, a trucker from North Carolina was sitting there watching the work, immersed in the work. He didn't dump his load and leave. He sat and watched the unloading and unpacking of his truck down onto the dock and the reloading, repacking up onto the ship, and he had an epiphany. It was the wrong problem framing. The real problem was the week that the ship sat idle in the port. And so he, of course, realized, just take the back of my truck off my truck, put it on the ship. He invented containerization. Not only did shipping not die, 90% of everything goes around the world today. The cost of shipping is 5% of what it was in the 1950s. And this is responsible for the breadth of goods and prices we have in the United States and the livelihood of most developing nations around the world, because of the ability to see what other people missed and reframe the problem and get to a much better solution. So back to getting to school on time. I know there's a lot of different ways we could frame it and solve it, but I leave you with this request. If there are any juniors in the audience who have a car and are going to be driving next year, please get in touch with me. Thank you.